Russia has played a game so far where it's been spinning it out, avoiding taking a position, playing for time, and in the process, Donald Trump has been giving them better and better terms while blaming Zelenskyy for not having made any progress.
Now, the special envoy to the US, Steve Witkoff, has visited President Putin in Moscow to discuss the prospect of peace between Russia and Ukraine. Here's the moment the two met, displaying visible warmth.
How are you, Mr. President? Very to speak it. Very so good to see you.
The Kremlin said the meeting lasted 3 hours and that the talks were constructive. And earlier I spoke with Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, former policy director at the Senate Armed Service Committee, and he said President Trump's drive to secure peace in Ukraine is entirely self-interested.
It's clear where his loyalties lie. They lied to Donald Trump, right? In other words, all he cares about. He's an opportunist and a narcissist. And if you just put everything he says through those two paradigms, I think you'll understand Donald Trump perfectly. The opportunity here for him is to be his initially 24-hour, now 100-day plan is to bring peace to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and then over to Iran, Israel, Hezbollah, Gaza, and try to do the same there in some ludicrous attempt to gain a Nobel Prize or some other positive international accolade that will redound to his long-term legacy, which is, I think we all understand, 0 degrees Kelvin likely to happen.
It comes that President Trump has doubled down on his assertion that Crimea now belongs to Russia following its annexation in 2014. I spoke to Ukraine's Deputy Foreign Minister, Mariana Betsa, and I asked her about the level of influence of the Kremlin over the White House.
Well, first and foremost, Russia does lie. Russia lies on an industrial scale. It has been doing it for ages. It has invested billions into Russian propaganda, disinformation. It's an element of its hybrid warfare, waged not only against Ukraine, but also against Europe and against the entire democratic world. This war is not a conventional war. There is also a very big hybrid dimension to this war, and we should be very mindful that you cannot trust Russia.
Okay, we can bring in now Peter Westmacott, former UK ambassador to the United States. Good afternoon.
Hello, good afternoon to you.
So Ukrainian officials and actually also the UK's Emily Thornberry have now called upon the US to stop what they call the appeasement of Putin. Do you agree with that?
Well, I'm not surprised that people are now using that kind of language. I think it's been clear for the last week or so that there was a moment of truth coming when the United Kingdom would have to decide whether it continued to go along with everything that Washington was up to, or whether it would have to make a stand and say, this is a bad deal from Ukraine's point of view, and it is totally inconsistent with the position which the United Kingdom and other Europeans and other allies of Ukraine have been taking for the last couple of years. So I think we are quite close to that. I'm sure that Number 10 are continuing to do their best to work the phones to Washington to try to dissuade the Americans not to keep offering more and more incentives, more and more goodwill, if you like, to the Kremlin and to reach a more balanced position. But, on the detail of this, doesn't look like we've made much progress as a government so far, so I'm not surprised that Emily and others are beginning to change their tune.
And when do you think it becomes difficult or unsustainable for Keir Starmer to publicly decline to criticise Trump on questions like this, for example, while also clearly holding the position privately that this recent language from Trump, you would imagine, is not acceptable and certainly not the UK position?
Well, I think if the Witkoff-Putin meeting had gone in such a way that it looked like there was agreement between America and Russia, and it was being rammed down the throat of the Ukrainians, and it was the kind of bad deal that Washington has been touting lately, in other words, sanctions relief, Russia keeping the territory it's occupied, no NATO membership prospects, no guarantees, no foreign troops, peacekeepers, all that stuff, then I think that might have been a moment when the Prime Minister would have wanted to say something pretty firm, which was different to what Washington's saying. But the little bit of the report that I have picked up so far, correct me if I'm wrong, from the Kremlin spokesman, is that Putin and Witkoff seem to have considered the possibility, or at least discussed the idea of, direct talks between Ukraine and the Kremlin. Now, hitherto, these talks have all been run by the Americans with the Russians, and the Ukrainians, if you like, left as bystanders. If there is now a serious attempt to try to bring the Ukrainians and the Russians together around a table and to work out a deal that Ukraine can live with, then I think A, that's potentially better news, but B, it probably means that the British government does not have to make a public stand which will make it unpopular in Washington.
That's interesting. So if indeed, at this tentatively optimistic note, it looks like there are direct negotiations coming between Ukraine and Russia, that might free Keir Starmer up to perhaps speak his mind more.
Yeah, I mean, against that, I would add that Russia has played a game so far where it's been spinning it out, avoiding taking a position, playing for time, and in the process, Donald Trump has been giving them better and better terms while blaming Zelenskyy for not having made any progress. So, I don't have huge faith in, if you like, Russian good behavior, but I think at least this is potentially something that is useful and might lead to a less objectionable deal than what we've all been reading about for the last few days.
And I guess the question is, even if you can get them round the table and speaking directly with each other, it's very hard at the moment to see what a landing zone that would be acceptable to both Zelenskyy and Putin would be.
I agree. And it can only work in the event that the Kremlin position softens, which is not very likely at the moment. And of course, Zelenskyy has said very firmly that it's unconstitutional and politically unacceptable for Ukraine to give up Crimea or any other parts of their sovereign territory. So the gap is still a pretty big one.
And I mean, what does the exit of the US, if it does happen from that process, actually look like? Because it seemed like the proposal that was given to Zelenskyy and Ukraine last week in Paris was so far from where they were anyway, that it wasn't that this kind of mediation from the US had necessarily been that helpful at the moment anyway.
Yeah, I agree, because Zelenskyy accepted the earlier American suggestion of a 30-day ceasefire. The Russians did not. The Americans then offered more sweeteners to Kremlin and then blamed Zelenskyy for saying, you've gone too far towards humoring Putin, not surprisingly. So you're right. I don't think that was a terribly helpful element of mediation, which is why I've been concerned that we might be heading for the moment of truth that you were asking me about. But let's see where this leads, if it's for real, if there are going to be some direct talks, and I think very importantly, if the United States of America is going to be a bit more in the role of an honest broker rather than somebody who is clearly in the camp of the Kremlin, then that's potentially encouraging, but we just don't know. And the record of the Kremlin on this has not been encouraging. So let's not hold our breath. But I think let's also, nevertheless, look at the little bits of hope that just might be there in the language that the Kremlin spokesman has been using in the last hour or so.
Indeed. And if I can, I'd like to get your thoughts on Rachel Reeves' trip to Washington. She's meeting with Scott Bessent, the US Treasury Secretary, today. And you've been in the room with the Americans as the former UK ambassador to the US. What are the big obstacles, do you think, to a deal? How do you think they might be overcome?
The big obstacles at the moment are that Donald Trump remains very keen on tariffs, not just the most beautiful word in the English language, but as a means of raising additional revenues, which will give him scope for the tax cuts that he wants to be able to offer when the current round expire later this year. The clue is in the name. He's creating something called the External Revenue Service. That's like the Internal Revenue Service, only bringing the money in from abroad. The only problem is with tariffs is that it's your own consumers and your own manufacturers who pay it. It's not the foreigner. So that is a big problem for, I think, actually for the United States economy, but it's also a big problem for America's trading partners. For the UK, we're hit at the moment with this 10% tariff. We've also got 25% on cars and steel and aluminium. That's a big deal because the United States is a very important market for the high-end manufacturers of motor cars in the UK. And I think, the likes of Range Rover, Aston Martin, Rolls-Royce, Bentley, all these prestige brands will have a real problem competing in that market if the 25% is left there. So that's a big obstacle. From the UK's point of view, if they are to reach some sort of trade agreement which would see the Americans remove these tariffs, or at least reduce them, then we would obviously have to reduce tariffs on US vehicle imports. I think that's okay. They're 10% at the moment. They can come down to 2 or 3%, as the media have been suggesting. I don't see a huge problem with that. agriculture is more difficult, and there are a number of sectors, financial services, pharmaceuticals, where it could be tricky. So I suspect that Rachel Reeves is having some quite tricky conversations in that area. The farmers are up in arms about elements of the last budget. They won't want to be, as they would see it, thrown under the bus in a trade deal with America, which means that cheap food, meat, chicken, and the rest of it is going to be brought in from America, which further weakens the position of British farmers. So that's a tricky one for her. But you know, if there is a semi-comprehensive trade deal to be struck, which allows the UK to have much less than 10% and certainly the 25% taken off, then that would be a significant achievement. It's still, I'm afraid, bad news because free trade has done us all very well, and tariffs are going to be bad for the US economy as well as bad for America's trading partners.
And just finally, before I let you go, on this question of, and indeed, I mean, it's a live debate, whether or not there is any relation between how Rachel Reeves acts with the US and hopes for a broader reset with the EU. Do you think it's possible to both get a good deal with the US and the EU?
It's obviously a top priority for the government to reset its relations with the European Union. You know, that's self-evidently the sensible thing to do after all the kerfuffle of Brexit and the problems that we've had with that. Now, if we end up with a trade deal, which means that the UK alone is getting tariffs of, let's say, for sake of argument, 2 or 3%, and the European Union is still stuck with 10, and if we lose the 25% tariffs on steel, aluminium, and motor cars, which is being applied to cars from the European Union, then I think people in the European Union will be a bit fed up and will probably be looking for ways of equalizing or leveling the playing field, if you like. So I think there will definitely be one eye on that at a time when Rachel Reeves and others are now looking at things like youth mobility, you know, bringing young people, giving young people the greater ability to travel around the European Union to live and work and study in Britain and vice versa. I think it's a thoroughly desirable objective. But that may become more difficult, and ditto the defence relationship, which I think is absolutely fundamental between the UK and the rest of Europe. All those things may become a little trickier if our European partners think that we're getting a better deal than they are. So it's a difficult balancing act. I think it can be done, but it will require a lot of delicate footwork, and it does require reminding the Europeans, not reminding, it's the wrong word, but it requires working with the Europeans so that they fully grasp that if Europe is going to do more about its security at a time when we cannot rely on the United States as much as we have in the past, then the UK has to be a significant part of that, along with the other big European defence players like the French in particular, but also the Spanish, the Italians and the Germans.
Indeed. Well, thank you so much for talking us through that. Peter Westmacott, former UK ambassador to the United States.